I, along with Dave, Ed, and Matt, the people who are going to be presenting today, have been involved in this industry for many, many, many years, many years. And just to give you a little background of the industry, back in the mid-70s, and Cliff is here, who wrote the fact book, is joining us today. So if I say any numbers incorrectly, he'll correct me. But back in the mid-70s, there were probably about 10, 15,000 associations in the United States. Right now, there's about 358,000 associations in the country. And what happened yesterday in New Jersey is probably the most transformative thing that I've seen happen in our industry since I've been involved in it. I've been involved for a while, and it's just very transformative of what's happening in terms of keeping our community safe and making sure that we're all financially secure. So we've got a PowerPoint that we're going to give. People can have a copy of it. It's set up in different sections where I'm going to present. Dave is going to present, Ed's going to present, Matt's going to present. Just to give you a little background of the people that are presenting, my name is Mitch Frumkin. I'm a licensed engineer, also a reserve specialist. I've been involved in the industry for many years. And I've been president of the New Jersey chapter. I, along with Dave, we've also been national presidents of the organization. Ed, I'm not sure if you were president of the chapter. I don't, my memory.
Yes, I was.
I'm sorry, Ed, president of the chapter. And we've been involved in what's been going on nationally with this for a number of years now. And like I said, it's a huge transformative change in our industry. And that's why we have such a huge turnout today. But we limited it to 100 to keep everybody paying more money for it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch over to a PowerPoint, and I'm going to share the screen, and then we're going to go through the PowerPoint. And let's see. I just got to share my screen. So can everybody see this screen that I'm showing you now?
Yep.
Okay, you should see it. So again, like I said, this is something, it's a press release that was issued yesterday from the governor's office, and in regards to passing this legislation. You'll hear a little bit about it as we go along, but this is something that the New Jersey chapter and the national organization has been working on for many, many years, which we'll go into a little. But it's a huge feather in the cap to CAI, both locally and nationally, as you'll see as we go through the presentation. I will say that we try to keep our seminars to 1 hour, our webinars to 1 hour. Today, based on what's going on and the amount of speakers and the amount of information that we're going to be passing on, we're probably going to go a little longer, which is fine. The other thing is that if you have any questions, please, or comments, please drop them in the chat box, because in the chat box, Chelsea from my office is going to be monitoring that. And if you just so, because there's a lot of people here, even though there should have been a lot more. So this just happened yesterday. And the speakers, as I mentioned before, are myself, Dave Ramsey, Ed St. George, and Matt Earle. And what are we going to be talking about is the New Jersey new law. I just went through the entire PowerPoint yesterday and changed it from pending legislation to new law, which was a good feeling to do that. What I've got now first, before we get started, just so we know who's here, who's in the audience, I'm going to throw up a very quick poll. And if you could just take a couple of seconds, you can see it on the screen. You should be able to see it on the screen. It has some questions about who's here, as well as some information about the communities that you're working on. So it'll just take a couple of seconds. Then I'm going to share the results with everybody. And it'll give us a little bit of a feel for who the audience is, although we pretty much know who it is from the sign-up sheet. So
buildings in the community constructed of single choice concrete, steel, or wood. I don't know.
Yeah, some of them wood for sure. Some of the buildings are for wood.
That's why I just check them off, all of them, because I don't know.
Some of them will have concrete, and yeah,
And
I heard they do.
you can only do.
Oh, then just do one. Yeah.
if you guys, if you're talking, if you wouldn't mind muting yourself in a second, when we go back to the presentation, I'm going to hit mute all. As soon as people stop answering, we'll stop, but they keep on coming in.
I think we have a good enough idea, Mitch.
Okay. Yeah, we're up to 77 people responded. So here is, so you can everybody see the results? Primarily community managers, board members, some attorneys, no accountants, a couple of reserve providers and engineers. And now here's a couple of interesting questions that 84% have buildings that are older than 15 years, which will tie into the presentation. Out of those buildings, 36% are concrete. And this will also tie into the presentation that 61% of them are wood. And do any of your communities have a parking garage? Half of them have parking garages. This is interesting. 75% do have preventive maintenance plans. And 98% have reserve studies. I guess in some cases, maybe we're preaching to the choir here, so to speak. Are reserve studies more than 5 years old? That's a good answer. Over 75% are less than 5 years old. And here, this is the last question. 56% of you have had special assessments and borrowing money to do some work on your in your community from apparently not adequate reserve funds, which we'll talk about also.
And Mitch, Ed will talk about, it's one thing to have a reserve study. It's another thing to be funding in accordance with it. So I'm sure there'll be some discussion on that later.
Absolutely. So that's interesting for everybody to see, the audience. And now I'm going to go through a little background of how we got here. And I'm sure everybody here is familiar with this picture. This is Champlain Towers. And this is the tragedy that occurred in June of 2021, where 98 people were killed. And, some of us know some people who were there who were killed as part of this building collapse. So what happened immediately after that, which has led up to where we are right now in New Jersey, is CAI nationally immediately put together a task force. And both myself, Dave, and Ed were on that task force to develop what ultimately came out as known as the Condominium Safety Public Policy Report. As part of this public policy report, which is, let me
upgrade.
I am going to stop share for a second because I think that's the only way I can mute everybody. Mute all. Yes. All right, there we go. So now I'm going to go back to share screen. Okay. So CAI nationally developed the public policy on condominium safety. As part of developing that public policy, it was agreed pretty across the board that in order to keep our buildings safe, it's not just doing structural inspections, which the public policy talks about, but there's a direct connection to reserve studies as well as maintenance. So the next thing CAI nationally did is they put together a task force that Ed and I were on and have updated the National Reserve Study Standards, which were released a few months ago, that have a connection between reserves as well as maintenance, as well as structural integrity. And there were no real articles or publications out in regards to maintenance. So CAI has also issued a public best practices report on maintenance, which a few of us were involved in putting together. So what happened is about 2 years ago already, Senator Singleton approached CAI and said, I want to put together some legislation in regards to building safety. And other people will touch on this, but that is where this legislation came from. It pretty much mimics everything CAI did nationally, which then flowed down to the local chapters. And I will tell you, and I've said it a number of times, if CAI didn't jump into this the way they did proactively, I don't know what would happen across the country when people are asking what they should do to keep their buildings safe. The one other comment I'll make is that public policy is just in the being updated because it came out a couple of years ago already. It's being updated, and today, by coincidence, there's a Government and Public Affairs Committee meeting of CAI National where the updated public policy is going to be voted on and I'm sure approved and then passed on to the board for approval. But some of this stuff that's in the update have been incorporated into the New Jersey legislation because we were involved in putting that together. A couple other things I want to go over is, because there's some terminology that's going to be used when everybody speaks. And I just want to make sure we're all on the same wavelength of what it is. So what is a building structure? A building structure is what holds it up. So that's what it is. So, but when you talk about the building structure in the public policy and the legislation, there's a term called primary load-bearing system. And Dave has asked me 10 times over the last few days what it means. Me just kidding me. But the primary load-bearing system is essentially the what in the building keeps it from falling down, one piece of the building. So when you look at a building like this, you'll see what are called columns, that are the vertical things that go up and down. And my area columns go up and down. They support the floors and the roof. Bracing, which are these diagonal blue lines that when the wind blows, it keeps them from blowing over. And beams, which support the floors and the roof. So this is what's the primary load-bearing system. Now, I'll show you why. You'll see as part of Dave's presentation why it's so important that we understand what that is. And this is what it looks like. This is a building in Princeton that was under construction. I happened to be walking by and I took this picture. But in order to make the point of why it's so important and what primary load-bearing system means, I took that picture and I said, okay, let's say that one thing, that one diagonal brace is missing. If that's missing and the wind blows, this part of the building will fall over. So that's why when we say primary load-bearing system, it's the primary parts of the building that are not repetitive, that if something happens to them, there could be a partial or total collapse of the building. Here's another one. If this column is gone, this lower column, what happens? This whole building corner collapses. If it's the top column that's gone, it's just the top of the building. They're all part of the primary load-bearing system. If this beam collapses, there's nothing to hold up the floor. Now, you'll see when Dave is talking in a few minutes why certain types of building are excluded from this policy, and it's because they don't have a primary load-bearing system. They have a repetitive design, not something that's critical if one piece of the structure disappears. So keep that concept.
Mitch, if I could add one clarifying point. The definition talks about the primary load-bearing system delivering the load to the foundation, not to the ground. This becomes important later on because the word foundation is not part of the primary load-bearing system. So otherwise, every single family home would have been required to have an inspection under this statute if it included the foundation.
Yeah, it's a good point. And so if you look at this diagram again, you see that these loads are interconnected. They're interconnected by the column down to the foundation, by this bracing down to the foundation. So it's all interconnected down to the foundation. And it says that if you have this type of, when Dave describes what is a governed building, what's included, you'll see that if it is a primary load building system of the type we're talking about, then the foundation is included. If it's not, the foundation isn't included. So the foundation is not something that will make the building be a covered building. So, but it's a great point because, you know, one of the things that's going to come up as part of this presentation is, and I'm sure everybody's wondering, what do I have to worry about for my community? Am I included in this or am I not included in this? Another term is life cycle cost. Essentially, life cycle cost, which we're going to talk about, is how much does it cost over the life of a community or over the life of the building to build it, to maintain it, to operate it, energy utility costs. And the reason why this is a very important term is, you'll see as part of the presentation, that by this legislation, it's going to ultimately reduce the life cycle costs of your communities, not increase them, which some people are afraid they may do. And we're going to touch on that. Other thing, maintenance. What does maintenance mean? There's 3 types of maintenance which are included in the legislation. I think Dave's going to be talking about that. There's deferred maintenance. Deferred maintenance means you're deferring it and you're not doing it. Preventive maintenance is a proactive thing where you're doing something proactively to make sure things do not deteriorate. They don't deteriorate. That's preventive maintenance. Corrective maintenance is maintenance that when you find a problem, you have to fix it. And that's corrective maintenance. So keep in mind these terminologies because in the legislation, they're each, I don't think deferred is used, but corrective and preventive maintenance is used. And you have to understand what the differences are that they are when it comes to maintaining our buildings. So that's maintenance. The last thing I wanted to mention, let's see if I can switch slides. Again, I wanted to mention that there's a connection between reserve studies, structural evaluations, and maintenance. And the tragedy of Champlain Towers is, I hate to say it, what came out of that tragedy is a huge transformative change to our industry for the better. And what's included in new legislative law is periodic structural inspections, reserve studies, and funding, which we'll talk about, and maintenance. And the other thing I want to mention before I turn it over to Dave is that keep in mind when you're listening to this, we're talking about structural integrity and reserves. They're interconnected, but that doesn't mean your community has to do both. Structural integrity inspections are for certain types of construction. Reserves are for all types of communities. So we're going to talk about who's covered under this and who's required to do things based on this law. But keep in mind, it's not everybody for both of them. So that's something we'll be talking about. And the other thing I just want to mention is that even without this law, these things are happening. You're all familiar with what's going on with Fannie and Freddie with their mortgage applications and the safety and the reserves and all that kind of stuff. Insurance it's popping up in insurance applications and the cost of insurance legislation, what we're talking about, and just basic community planning. But this is happening even without laws. So, and now I'm going to turn it over to Matt Earle. Matt is the chair of the CAI's Legislative Action Committee, and I think he may have given his pitch already when we were waiting. But Matt's going to talk a little bit about what CAI does and in terms of legislation. So Matt, are you there somewhere?
I'm here. Thanks, Mitch. And I'll leave all the technical aspects of this to Mitch, Dave, and Ed, who are the experts in it. I'm just here to bring a little charisma. So the CAI Legislative Action Committee is a body. We're actually a committee of the national organization, but we function within the New Jersey chapter. We have a function of reviewing proposed legislation and regulations and monitoring them to see, for impact on the community associations and to give our input on those bills. And we also introduce legislation that we think will be beneficial for our constituents, which include, the entire industry and the residents of those communities. And so the LAC is very active. We have a bunch of people on the committee: managers, attorneys, engineers, insurance experts, the whole gamut of industry professionals who are involved. And we meet once a month, and in between we have a lot of other activities. And so we engage a professional lobbyist. Our lobbying firm is called MBI Gluckshaw, and in particular we use a person named Michelle Jaker, who is excellent, and her team is excellent. And we've had a lot of success since we engaged her a few years ago. That does cost money. And the other thing we need money for is our political action committee, we call the PAC, which donates money to lawmakers, for fundraisers and things like that, which, you pay money, you go to a fundraiser, you get some FaceTime with the person to express your concerns. And one thing I want to mention, of course, you all know that for a law to be passed in New Jersey, it has to pass the Senate and the Assembly, and then it has to be signed by the governor. The governor can not sign a bill, do a pocket veto. The governor can not sign a bill and veto it straight out, or he can do a conditional veto where he says make these 10 changes or whatever. He sends it back marked up, and then it gets voted on and passed or not. Of course, he can also sign a bill. And one of the things that happens, so the other thing I'll mention is that the legislative session is a 2-year session, right? There's an election for the legislature every 2 years. And so what you see is, right now, we just started the new session today, right? So yesterday was the last day of the old session. Today is the first day of the next 2-year session. And so there's this 2-year legislative cycle. And what was crazy about this bill is we got the governor's signature yesterday at the deadline, at the finish line. And I want to just describe a little bit, and then I'll turn it back to these guys, the efforts that were made by them and others in our group. So, we introduced this bill pretty much through Senator Singleton. One other thing I'll mention, though, is that there was a conscious effort by the legislature this year, or this past session, to slow down the progress of legislation. They were alarmed that a lot of bills got passed quickly and sort of, I don't want to say slipshod, but people were surprised by the contents sometimes. So they decided to increase committee activity and require most bills to go through 2 committees per chamber. So that slowed down the process. So we introduced this pretty much at the beginning of this past legislative session. And for the last 2 years, we've been working to get it across the finish line. And at the beginning, there was certainly no guarantee at all that this bill would pass. And in fact, we didn't know it was going to pass the Assembly basically until it did, right before it did, which was, I think, around December 21st or December 22nd. And then after that, we didn't know if the governor was going to sign it or not. And what happens in the governor's office, right? There's not always great communication between the governor and the legislature. So he tends to veto a lot of bills, even though, they're Democratic bills and he's a Democratic governor. But we were successful in discussing with the governor's office. And also, that's really pressure from the agencies that might be involved in this, like the DCA, Department of Community Affairs, et cetera. We were able to have those communications and finally, like yesterday, find out that he wasn't going to veto it, he was going to sign it. And so that's a long way of saying that we took multiple meetings. We must have met the 50, 60 meetings. We met with pretty much everyone. Mitch, Dave, and Ed went to Trenton. They testified before the committees. There was an enormous effort to get this bill passed, and there was an enormous amount of compromise that had to go into it. And legislation, sometimes the perfect is the enemy of the good. And in this particular case, right, this bill, when it started, was not only about community associations, but the structural integrity piece would have applied to all covered structures. And there had to be compromises made because there were industry groups like the apartment organization and the builders who had some things to say about it and who carry some sway in Trenton. And we had to make some compromises. So as you'll see, even though there's no logical basis for it, apartment buildings, rental buildings are not covered by the need to do structural inspections. Is that great policy? Probably not. But if we had insisted on that not being changed, this bill never would have been passed. And so, you might notice some of those things. And I can only tell you that to get this across the finish line and to protect our constituents, which is what our job is, we had to make some compromises. And we'll see if those things get changed. And then there were things that happened while the bill was being negotiated, which in fact expanded it, like the collapse of the balcony in Jersey Shore, that ended up including balconies into this bill as part of the structural inspections that were required. So, with that being said, if you're in this industry and you want to see good legislation, it's critical that you, from time to time, find a way to donate some money to the PAC. And that can be done through attending PAC events like, PAC the Rooftop and things like that, where you can go and have some fun and, pay a small amount. And that will help contribute to our cause of being successful with our legislative efforts. And I will say, and I don't think arrogantly, that over the last six or 8 years, we've been very successful. Both, you remember a couple of years ago, there were the new lien laws passed, things like that. We've had a lot of our priorities get through, and we've killed a lot of bills that would have been very negative to our industry. So there's a lot of things you don't hear about, which are bills that get killed, on the vine before they even get voted on because we apply pressure at the right time. So with that being said, Mitch, I will turn it back over to you and Ed and Dave.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to pass it over to Dave to talk about structural integrity. I have to mention this is my first real involvement in the political system. Dave has taught me a different language. It's called legislative writing that he translates to me, and he's going to translate it to us now. And the other thing I have to say is that it's been a good experience for me because I learned a new word. It's called bipartisan. And this legislation passed both the Assembly and the Senate in New Jersey in a bipartisan manner. And it took me a while. I had to look it up, but now I understand what it is. I've never seen it before, but that happened. So now I'm going to turn it over to Dave to talk about cover the structural integrity part of the legislation.
Thank you, Mitch. And good morning, everybody. And we couldn't be more thrilled that you're here. I just want to make one further comment to Matt's comments, which I agree with in their entirety. The New Jersey legislature in the 2-year session has over 5,000 bills introduced. Okay. And I don't know what the exact number that are passed are, but I would say it's less than 5%. So if you're an odds maker, you can say your chances are about 20-1 against getting a bill passed, particularly a major bill like this. And although we did compromise, as Matt certainly said, we had to compromise. To our core constituency, we don't believe the compromises on our core constituency, which is community associations, was really negatively impacted. We took things out that really weren't part of our constituency just because it was logical. Building, as Mitch's one of Mitch's favorite sayings, a building doesn't know if it's a condo or co-op. It's a building. And The apartment owners, for instance, claim that they do such a wonderful job maintaining their buildings, time for a chuckle, that they didn't need this bill. So anyway, I'm going to talk about first, what is a covered building? And keep in mind, and Mitch mentioned this, we're only talking about the structural inspection part of the bill. We are not talking about the reserve side. So as far as construction, the structural integrity and structural inspection side, it's only applicable to covered buildings. Now, what is a covered building? So Mitch already told you what a primary load-bearing system is. And if that primary load-bearing system is constructed from concrete, masonry, steel, or hybrid structure, often steel and masonry, heavy timber, or podium decks, and I'll describe what that is in just a minute, then it is a covered building. All right, we can go to the next slide, Mitch. What is excluded? Now, we were pretty confident when the bill was originally drafted that if you understood what a covered building was, you also knew what excluded was. The builders, however, came to us and said, well, we want to be super clear on what's excluded. So there's a definition of excluded structures, and those include frame construction, okay? Frame-built construction. So frame-built construction are your typical single-family homes, typical townhouses, standard townhouse construction, those sorts. Sometimes it's even, you can have 4-story buildings that are frame construction. So they might look like a mid-rise building, but still be frame construction. Those are excluded from what is a covered building. Also, ancillary elements of a building. So one of the concerns of the builders that they expressed was, well, we could have a frame building, but it could have an elevator. The shaft is made of concrete. That would seem to be covered under this building. And we said, well, no, that was never the intent. So we'll specifically exclude those kinds of ancillary elements of a building, because that's not really holding up the building. As Mitch has taught us, the reason frame construction is excluded is you could have any one or even several of those wood structural elements fail. The building will not fall down because there's so many elements. There are so many parts of that wood frame construction, hundreds and hundreds in a building, that a couple of them being negatively impacted is not going to cause the building to fall down. And as was already mentioned, we excluded non-condo and co-op buildings. Okay. So one thing that is included, and Mitch has the picture up there right now of it, is podium construction. What is that? So this is typical where you have a first floor level that could be a garage. It could be a commercial part of the building.
Wow.
And you see that in often urban areas. We see a lot of this kind of construction in Hoboken. We see it along the waterfront, but we see it elsewhere also. And so you have frame construction where the residents are. Above it, is that excluded or included? Well, in this case, it's included because what is holding up that frame construction is, in fact, the elements that we're concerned with. And why are we limited to those elements? Because these are the kind of elements, as I kind of inferred earlier, that if you have one failure, and Mitch showed you when he showed you the construction of the buildings, one failure can cause a partial or total collapse of the building. Okay. So if you're managing or you're a board member of an included building, when is your first inspection due? Well, Mitch, we can go to the next slide. So if the building was constructed after the bill's passage, and yesterday is the effective date of the bill, so that's an important date, Any building built after has 15 years before their first inspection or 60 days after observable damage. So if a truck or a car rammed into a column in a covered building and caused damage to that column, well, then you have to have the inspection done by a structural engineer at that point in time. What about buildings that were built before the bill became effective? Well, in those cases, if your building was built more than 15 years ago, which would be anything prior to 2009, any building that got a CO prior to 2009, you have 2 years to get your first structural inspection by a structural engineer. If the building is less than 15 years since the CO was issued, you have 1 year after reaching the 15th anniversary of the issuance of the CO for the building. So there will be a series of necessary inspections that will be coming up for older buildings. And we can go to the next slide, Mitch. One other, and it's not a common thing as much as it used to be today, but we do see conversions, and we do see them where buildings are being adapted from one use to another use. We see this with old factories, old school buildings, things of that nature, where they're turned into condominiums. Today, if that were to happen, or I should say, before this bill passed, if that were to happen, and a builder was filing a registration with the Department of Community Affairs, which would include a public offering statement, the only thing the builder would have to do is a general visual inspection, and that visual inspection would have to say, here's the basic condition of the elements of the building. It did not require an inspection by a structural engineer for the structural integrity of the building. Now, in most conversions, the units are sold as is, and the common elements are sold as is. It was critical, therefore, that in a conversion building, that there be a structural inspection before the building is registered, and that structural inspection be made part of the registration process, so that when buyers viewed their public offering statement, they would know whether there were structural concerns. Unfortunately, some developers will try to stick the association with fixing problems in the building. If that were to happen, buyers should know that they're going to get stuck with it. Now, of course, the builder should include that in the budget. So one would hope that if a builder is converting a building and finds some problem with structure, they will fix it beforehand so that it doesn't raise fees extraordinarily. Okay, we can go to the next slide, Mitch. Okay, so now we're talking about the report that would be done by a structural engineer, okay? And Mitch, for instance, is a structural engineer, and there may be others who are on this webinar who are also structural engineers, and they're going to have a new area to deal with. So what do they have to include in their reports? First of all, the condition of the primary load-bearing system. Now, this is a visual inspection. Unless they were to note something from the visual inspection that indicated the possibility of a problem, they would not be required to go further. But as Mitch would tell you, if you saw, for instance, rust-colored stains on the outside of a concrete column, you might have a problem with that, because it might indicate the rebar or steel within that column is rusting, and it could be a future problem. They also are required to report the required maintenance or the repair, and a description of the repair in the report. So that structural engineer sees something that needs to be dealt with today, they have to note it. Even if it's not absolutely required today, they have to note it, and they have to suggest a time period within which that needs to be dealt with. Also, any required corrective maintenance. Mitch mentioned the difference between various kinds of maintenance. Corrective maintenance would be undertaking something today that will help preserve the life of those parts of the primary load-bearing system. So that's required to be set forth. That, by the way, you might say, well, doesn't a reserve study do that? No, reserve studies don't do that. First of all, you get your first reserve study. It may be a comprehensive study that looks at every element in the building, but very often people get updates or associations get updates that do not require further inspections. And in addition to which, reserve specialists who conduct the reserve studies aren't structural engineers. They aren't capable or competent of determining whether there is a structural problem with the building. Now, some reserve specialists are structural engineers, but they certainly aren't all structural engineers. The last item in the report is that the report must indicate when the next inspection is to be performed. Now, you should understand that after that first inspection at the 15-year mark, the next one is after 10 years, and then every 5 years thereafter. But if the structural engineer determines that there are potential issues that they're concerned about, but that don't require immediate action, they may come back and say, okay, you have 10 years or maybe 5 years. We need to look at this again in a shorter period of time to make sure that an issue isn't progressing or isn't, a possible issue we saw isn't getting worse. So those are the basic elements of that report.
And David, David Mitch, if I could just make one comment.
Please.
I mentioned before that the new reserve study standards connect together structure and maintenance. And one of the things they say is that if it's a community that needs to have periodic inspections like we're talking about, and the periodic inspection report says there is corrective maintenance needed, the report should say what it is, about how much it's going to cost, and how long a period of time it has to be before it's done. And the reserve study should include the cost of the corrective maintenance so the money can be included. Now, the difference in that and the prior way reserve studies were done was it was generally based on things that have a cycle of replacement every 10 years, every 15 years. But this is a one-time fix, so it's not cyclical, but it should be included into the reserve study as part of the new standards.
Thanks, Mitch. Okay, so how does this get enforced at the end of the day? How do we make sure that these inspections get done? How do we know that the board, once it gets a copy of a report that says work needs to be done within a certain period of time, how do we make sure that happens? Well, one of the things that has to happen is the report has to go to the local building official. So the local building official office, being your municipal building inspector, or formerly known as a construction official, gets a copy of the report. The report is also provided to building owners and is made available to residents on request. So the people in the building will be aware if there is a particular concern. Now, we expect that what will happen, as often happens in other types of inspections that occur, such as the DCA 5-year inspection, and let me just pause on that one for just a moment. Some people will say, well, doesn't the 5-year DCA inspection include the structural integrity of the building? The answer is no, it does not. And the DCA has, in fact, during this process said, we do not inspect the primary load-bearing system of a building when we're doing these routine inspections. So you can't rely on that for determining whether a building has a structural issue. So we would expect that when this goes to the local municipal authority and they see that the engineer has said something either needs to immediately be done or done within 6 months or done within a year, that the building official will follow up with the association and could issue a notice of violation, just like they do today for certain types of construction defects. They could issue a notice of violation that will require the board to undertake the necessary work. We can go to the next slide, Mitch. Well, I kind of mentioned this already, that it has to be a structural inspector, which is defined as a licensed professional engineer. Now, Mitch, you can comment on this certainly if you'd like. Not every licensed professional engineer is also a structural engineer. So it really depends on experience. There's no such thing as a licensed structural engineer, at least in the state of New Jersey. But Mitch, do you want to comment on what the difference is between just any licensed engineer and a structural engineer?
Well, clearly the structural engineer involves the structure of the building, like the primary load bearing system. But the thing to really take into account when you're retaining somebody to do this is that working on existing buildings with problems is a totally different expertise than designing a brand new building. So you really need to interview them and see the qualifications to make sure that they have experience, they're licensed, and they have experience with existing buildings, not just new buildings.
Now, there's an important element to being a licensed professional engineer who does these inspections, and that is if they determine that there is a structural problem, they must report it. They have an obligation not only to the association, but to the residents of the building if they determine that something is unsafe. They cannot take the risk that if they discover something unsafe and it is not dealt with, that that will be ignored. Even today, if that were to happen, the structural engineer is required to make that apparent to municipal authorities to make sure that the issue is dealt with. Now, one thing for those of you who are engineers that are attending this session, we did provide for certain immunity for people who are doing this, as long as the report is undertaken in accordance with the standards established by the American Society of Civil Engineers, ASCE, a well-known organization, and they do have very specific standards for these kinds of inspections, and they do so in good faith based upon that. And something were to happen later that hurt people or cause damage, they will be immune. Otherwise, if we didn't include that in the bill, we suspect that very few, if any, engineers would have been willing to undertake these kinds of reports. So, Mitch, that covers my section, and I think next we're going to Ed.
Yeah, Dave, I think there's a question for you in the chat box. Chelsea's going to tell you what it is.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, from Ben Lambert. It was a little bit ago, so apologies, Ben. Any idea whether DCA intends to use its PRED FDA rule making authority to promulgate regulations relative to this new legislation?
Okay, so the answer is no, but
That's a legal answer, by the way.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a great question. There is no rulemaking authority given to DCA in this bill. That was intentional. Furthermore, one of the issues we had to deal with when the bill was awaiting governor's signature is DCA had raised an issue indicating they did not want to be the enforcing entity on this bill. We had to go back and forth with the governor's counsel's office to explain why the DCA was not required to enforce the terms of this bill. Again, it's going through the local building official as far as this element of the bill goes. And DCA was not going to have an obligation. And the counsel's office said, but this is part of the Planned Real Estate Development Full Disclosure Act. There's already an enforcement provision in that bill. And we pointed out that it says DCA may enforce violations of PRED, not that they shall enforce violations. Now, interestingly enough, and I don't want to go on for too long, there is a oral argument before the appellate division today, as we are speaking, on the issue of the Radburn regulations. One of our arguments in that current litigation against DCA is that that bill also contained no rulemaking authority. We will be very interested to see what happens when the appellate division ultimately rules on that case. I'll just stop there.
Thank you, Dave. And now I'm going to turn it over to Ed, who's going to talk about who's required to do reserve studies, what's involved in that. I will also have to mention that as part of the National Reserve Study Update Task Force, Ed was on that committee or that task force that dealt with updating reserve study standards. So he's very familiar with this topic, that's for sure. So Ed, it's all yours.
Thank you, Mitch, and good morning, everybody. I'll probably be brief. I know Mitch has a lot more topics to cover. Mine is sort of transitional in nature. What we want to do is discuss who's affected by this legislation, what exists currently in any regulations, and what is about to change. And Mitch is going to cover much more of the changes than I am. So the new law, looking at the left side of this chart, Senate 2760, says that any association that was created in accordance with the Planned Real Estate Full Disclosure Act is an entity that's required to fund reserves in accordance with the law. To the right is the actual citation of a definition of what includes a planned real estate development. I'm not going to read it to you, but basically it's a common interest community association. So any association, an HOA, a condo, a co-op, that has been originally formed in accordance with the PREF of the Planned Real Estate Full Disclosure Act, is obligated to follow the new laws with respect to reserves. Next slide, please. So the only thing that is currently in place in any regulations with respect to reserves is, again, from PREFTA. And that's the NJLAC, New Jersey Administrative Code, Section 5:26, 8.7. That says that during the developer control of an association's governing board, that a developer shall provide adequate reserves for the repair and replacement of common elements in the facilities. There's really nothing else in any regulations or in any laws that obligate a common interest community to fund reserves. That has now changed yesterday, and that's what this, big part of what the S2760 is all about, that there are now very specific requirements. Next slide, please. So we're now going to talk about what is required under the new law. This reference says Section 10, I think in the final edits, and it's now Section 9, so I might be cross-referencing. I think it's now Section. But in terms of what developers have to do, that is different, is that they must issue a preventative maintenance document that includes a maintenance schedule that addresses preventative maintenance and a preventative maintenance plan. So preventative maintenance is typically maintenance that's done on a cyclical basis that provides maintenance to enhance and extend or maximize the useful life of that component. I think the schedules, and based on the new maintenance standards that CAI has adopted, we have to be mindful, and developers have to be mindful, and operating associations, post-developer, have to be mindful that you need to do, in effect, a component inventory of all of your common equipment, all of your common elements, the same as you might do for a reserve study, and not have any omissions. So we might typically see in a townhouse type development that there's, caulking, painting, seal coating, line striping, things of that sort, and then have a clubhouse and maybe not look at the preventative maintenance that's needed on the pumps and the HVAC equipment. Same thing, of course, with a high rise and a mid rise where there's elevators and substantially greater HVAC and mechanical like systems. Preventative maintenance and the documentation of that and the total inventory of all the preventative maintenance that needs to be done has to be incorporated. And then the preventative maintenance plan is a requirement and a definitional characteristic that gives a description of the recommended maintenance which should be performed to the component, the estimated period of time in which this maintenance should be performed, and the estimated cost for performing this maintenance, and then most importantly, the funding plan to fund the maintenance. Where you have a useful life, your preventative maintenance plan will have to identify the components, say at what frequency the maintenance is required, and what the cost will be for that, and then the boards, through their budgetary processes, have to put together a maintenance budget, a preventative maintenance budget to fund all of those costs. The other thing that's now included in the law is that budgets, both from a developer and from a stabilized association, must provide a preventative maintenance that is set forth in the maintenance schedule that addresses the structure of the building and includes the structural inspection. So the legislation, contemplated, anticipated, and now requires that there be periodic structural inspections, and that there in fact be a timing associated and a cost and a funding for that. So you'll see in either your PM schedules or your reserve schedules or an independent schedule. I think that's left to the author, but the point is that funding and identifying the costs that are necessary to conduct the periodic inspections that Dave has outlined in the scheduling, and what those costs are should be amortized, same as you might for a reserve schedule, and be budgeting each year to get to the total cost of what that's going to be. Next slide. So what's required now, again, back to PREFTA, the NJAC 5:26, all that's out there for developers, and again, back to any regulations, is that there shall be a reserve study conducted for the common elements for any new phase or any new community. If you only have one phase, then it's for the entire community. And then if there are additional phases, the developers have the obligation to update the reserve studies. And then there's an obligation that if in the course of development, the plans change, and they could be changing for a positive reason. It could be adding amenities or common elements and common equipment. Then the reserve studies have to be updated. That has been silent in the past. I suggest that good developers would have done that anyway, but now it's a regulatory requirement that they be updated. Next slide. And what was in place up until yesterday for associations in terms of reserve funding? Really nothing. And that was, one of the ironies of this whole process that we went through, that our industry, kind of dealt with or didn't have any real guidance on. There was no codified approach to what was required in the way of reserve funding and reserve schedules and the types of schedules, and Mitch is going to go into that in much greater detail. So we're grateful with this new law that there's a clear definition and a requirement, and we certainly applaud those that have these schedules and have them prepared properly, people, but this now makes it an absolute mandatory and gives great definition for that. Next slide, please. And lastly, what Mitch has, this chart, those of you know me know I can never produce this chart. This chart was prepared by Mitch, and what it is it's a typical reserve funding chart that if you've seen his or other engineer reserve studies, what would happen typically in the life cycle of an association. And so we start with the developer, building the community, preparing a public offering statement, establishing a reserve fund in the budget, and the yellow line in the lower left begins the process, and the reserves begin to build up over time. And then we hit a fork in the road. The developer loses control of the board, and then the association takes control, and I think two things can happen, right? The gray, darker line, the association board continues to fund their reserves to get to a place where they are adequate in their terms of funding, and Mitch is going to cover that in the future. And then the bad scenario is, for many reasons perhaps, the yellow line shows that the association is not funding in accordance with their reserve study and plan, and they in fact go negative. So when you drop down that slide on the graph, and you get below the horizontal line, you're in a negative position. And Mitch will talk about what's the baseline that you can go to. But if you're in negative, that means you have jeopardy. That means you may have to assess or borrow money. And those are the two scenarios that can occur. And we do hope that the reserve funding that Mitch is now going to talk about, that this legislation really gives everybody a great roadmap on how to conduct their reserve studies and meet the requirements. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. And I'm going to stay on this. Can you guys hear me? I think you can. I'm going to stay on this slide for a second to show you how this legislation is going to solve the problem, because at this point, this is where there was no legislation in place for associations. And now the associations are going to be required to maintain adequate funding. And that means that the cost of replacements will be distributed to the people that live there as they're using them, rather than reducing the fees and running into a deficit. So you have to have a special assessment or borrowing in the future. So this is one of the huge benefits of this legislation, is that you should stay financially strong, because you're going to be required, you are required to do reserve studies and to fund them, which I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about. So Ed had mentioned, just a little repetitive, that the new requirement that associations must undertake and fund. Now, it may seem crazy to say that, but they not only have to do reserve study, they have to fund it. Because if you look across the country, for example, there's probably about 12, 13 states that have some kind of requirement for reserves. Half of them say you have to do reserve studies, but don't say you have to fund it. The other half, you say you have to fund it, but doesn't say how much you have to fund it and where that comes from. So the new standards, as well as these regulations, require not only doing studies, but putting the money in based on what the study says. So the question becomes, which is always the question when it comes to reserves, is you must assess the adequacy of what the community has. It's pretty clear from that chart. What does adequate mean? Adequate essentially means, and the definition is in the legislation, is that the association must have a 30-year funding plan to ensure adequate funding. And it says the obligation to maintain without the need for a special assessment or borrowing. So this is essentially, this is the same graph. So in order to be adequately funded, you cannot run into a deficit during that 30-year period. That's what the legislation says. So, but what does that mean for you? What happens if you are underfunded? We'll get into that in a second. But it also says that the study should be prepared in conformance with the reserve study standards of the Community Associations Institute or similar standards. I will tell you that there really aren't any similar standards to CAI. It specifically references the CAI standards. There's a couple of other smaller organizations that have some kind of standards, but they're all based on the CAI old standards, not the updated standards. So any study should be prepared in conformance with the reserve study standards of CAI. Who needs to do the reserve study? It's very clear in here that the reserve study needs to be done in conformance with the latest edition. All reserve studies conducted pursuant to this section shall be performed or overseen by a reserve specialist. That's a designation given by CAI to people that it's called an RS, reserve specialist. That means that you are qualified and shown by example of your reports that you can do a reserve study in conformance with these standards. Or it goes on to say that if it's not a reserve specialist, it needs to be done by a professional, an engineer or architect licensed in the state. So keep in mind now, when you're getting reserve studies done for your associations, the requirements based on the statute is a reserve specialist or a licensed engineer who's doing it in conformance with these standards. I will say, backtracking just a second, that for developers, when they set up their reserve studies in their governing documents, the statute now says that there needs to be a letter of adequacy in the governing documents signed by a licensed architect or engineer saying that that reserve study is adequate. So just a little backtracking on that. But for associations, as they're doing it, I'm updating, RS or licensed engineer or architect, that's the requirement. For associations, when do they need to do their first study? If the study that you have is more than 5 years old, or if you don't have one, then a new study has to be done within 1 year of passage. Passage was yesterday. So I don't, based on the survey we did before, I think everybody here has a study, and I think 99% of them were less than 5 years old. What about updating? Or for a new association that you just take over, I don't know if anybody here is going through transition or turnover, but it's the first study should be done 2 years after election of the majority of the executive board. So I don't know if anybody fits in that category. How about updating them? Updates a maximum of 5 years. Shall be reviewed by licensed architect, engineer, or credential reserve special, and must be conducted and reviewed at least once every 5 years. I will tell you that the CAI best practices for reserve studies is that reserve studies should be updated every 3 years. And keep in mind, it says at least once every 5 years, because depending on the type of funding plan you have, if you're going to baseline funding, not to go into a lot of detail about that, but I think a lot of you know what I'm talking about. You may need, it may be recommended in the study that you have that it be updated sooner than 5 years, because the reserve study should include a recommendation of when the next update should be done. All right.
Mitch, I just for point
Sure.
of, because I know this question has already been asked, and not today, but by others who have looked at the bill. If you just back up that slide for a second, there's one mistake in the bill. And the mistake is that if you look at that first sentence, it says a covered building owner, which would include an association, that's a defined term, has to have this update done every 5 years. I described what a covered building was previously. This was a mistake by the Office of Legislative Services in using the phrase covered building owner. We are anticipating that this will be fixed this coming year in a very short corrective legislation, so that it no longer will say covered building owner. It will essentially say all associations. Thanks, Mitch.
Right, but thanks, Dave. But as you know from when we're going through this, the intent of this section is for all associations. This is just a misuse of a word. And
Yes,
and
correct.
Ed and Ed and Dave are smiling because we looked at this a billion times and it slipped by all of us. So we were counting on Dave to catch it, by the way, but he didn't.
Well, and I didn't.
Okay. Now the question is, what if you're not adequately funded? What if you're not adequately funding and you will run into a deficit? The legislation is very clear about catch-up periods, and it's tied in to your annual budget. So if in order to catch up, you need to increase your overall community's budget by 10%, then you have 10 years to catch up. Okay, so I mean, the other thing is there's also a little asterisk next to that, because if within that 10-year catch-up period you run into a deficit, then you have that time period to catch up, because if you don't catch up by that point, you're going to have to special assess or borrow anyway, so you have to catch up. But there are specific catch-up period tied into the budget. So if it affects it by more than 10%, it's 10 years. If it's less than 10%, you catch up within 2 years. And as you know, this presentation is to go over what's in the legislation, not necessarily to go into the how-to of this kind of thing, but there are catch-up periods. So now, as far as the reserves, you know, there's a connection between everything we're talking about. That's the purpose of this slide. It's to show you that reserves, this is a podium deck example where you have a podium deck with a membrane on top. The podium deck and that membrane are included in your reserve study. So let's say it has a 20-year life, and to replace that podium deck membrane, you have to maintain that podium deck, because if you don't, it's going to leak. If it leaks, it's going to get through to the structure underneath and cause huge amount of cost in corrective maintenance. So the point of this is to show that associations really need to be looking at the connections between their structure, their maintenance, and their reserves, because it all ties together. And what it does, if you do this, then you are actually going to reduce your life cycle costs, because there are studies that show that the cost of preventive maintenance, which people are afraid of, is approximately 5% of the replacement costs. But if you don't do preventive maintenance and you have to do corrective maintenance, it's going to cost you at least 30 times the cumulative cost of the preventive maintenance. So very important to understand the connections between these. This is just a community which was a high rise we worked on. Without preventive maintenance, it's $34 million over 30 years. With preventive maintenance, it's $31 million. So just by doing preventive maintenance, there's a $2 million savings over 30 years, which doesn't even include the cost of corrective maintenance. So I just want to point out that there's such a financial connection between all these in terms of the life cycle costs of your communities. That what this legislation or this law is doing is it's solving a huge problem for associations, but I hate to say it, by kind of forcing us to do what we should have been doing anyway. And now the last slide is just to show you some references. This is the best practice on reserve studies. This is a book on reserve studies. This is an explanation of the reserve study standards. I will tell you, if anybody, I will send everybody a copy of this presentation, but I will also tell you that these documents you're looking at are all in the process of being updated. Reserve Fund, the book in the middle, the draft of that book has gone to CAI National for editing just in the last few days. Best practices process being updated. They're all being updated to reflect the update in the National Reserve Standards, which was just finished the last few months ago. Now, in closing, I point out that the question is, when does this start? This is directly from the legislation. This act shall take effect immediately, which, unless my attorney friend Dave tells me I'm wrong, that means yesterday.
Correct.
I interpreted this correctly. And the other thing I want to mention is that we've talked a lot about what's in the legislation, but then it's what do you do with this to make it work for your community when their life cycle costs? So there are going to be some upcoming webinars on how do you know if your building requires periodic inspections, and if it does, what do you do? How do the reserve study requirements change while you do your reserve study planning? And the other thing is, how do you connect everything that we talked about today? So we went not that bad over, and I will say I'm going to stop sharing. If anybody has any questions, now's the time to unmute yourself and jump in. I hope this was beneficial to everybody. And if you have anybody who's been sending us texts about how we screwed up on the number of people, I don't know if Dave and Ed and Matt are available, but we already sent them an email that hopefully we're going to repeat this tomorrow. There were 350 people that signed up, and you're the exclusive 100 that got here first. So we're planning on doing this. Hopefully these guys are available to do tomorrow. So there's a couple of questions in here. Let's see.
Mitch, before you go to the questions, can I just make 2
please.
points on the reserves? Some people may say, well, why did CAI do this with regard to reserves? Some of these things won't even be an issue for 15 years. I won't be here 15 years from now. Why should I care? The reason that we thought this became critically important is all of us who participate in the industry have experiences where the lack of reserves have led to episodic special assessments, often in the tens of thousands of dollars. And those special assessments, when they come about, they end up with a huge reaction, not surprisingly. And often it's an older board who simply didn't decide to put away the adequate funds. They're no longer on the board, and the owners are angry at the existing board because they're now getting hit. And they say, oh, well, go get another inspection, go do this, go do that, go do a million other things, because we're going to vote you out if you do this, okay? And the answer is that's part of what led to the Surfside problem. That owners, the money that was required to fix the Surfside problem was so enormous that owners said, we can't afford it. We can't have that situation. We cannot have the situation where owners cannot afford it when a huge special assessment hits. That was the public policy that is behind CAI National's documents that Mitch referred to. That was our belief, that we strongly believed this was not a viable system. We would have deteriorating buildings over time if these reserves were not maintained. Now, second point I just want to quickly make. We say in this legislation that if you've got reserves, you can use as much of the money that is allocated to a particular item for that item when it needs to be replaced. In other words, the reserves cannot be treated as a piggy bank. So if you've got reserves, say right now today, you've got $1 million in reserves, and you've got a roof that has to be replaced on a mid-rise or high-rise building, and it's going to cost $500,000. But you only have $200,000 in the account, the reserve account, to pay for that. How do you deal with that delta of $300,000? Well, we did provide for that. We said you could borrow from the reserve account, provided you adopt a resolution that states that you will repay that borrowing within 5 years. So we did provide flexibility to allow boards to borrow. We did not want to put them in a hole so that they couldn't dig out of it, but they do have to make up that money within a fairly short, reasonably short period of time. So sorry, Mitch, I just wanted to add
I don't want
those.
you to get scared by what Dave just said, because that ties directly into the adequacy also. And if you are adequately funding, which you're going to have to do anyway, you should not, you shouldn't run into that problem. So it should be okay. And there was something else I was going to say, but Dave sidetracked me and I don't remember it anymore. I see Ben Lambert has a few questions. It says, if you have a pre-act reserve study that is less than 5 years old, do you need to have it reviewed within 1 year to confirm that is act compliant? If it's less than 5 years old, you need to update it within 5 years. So I don't.
No, yeah, but I think what Ben is asking is maybe it doesn't comply with the current CAI standards for reserve studies. So you've got one that's 4 years old, 3 years old, and it's done under the old standards. Is there anything in the act that would require you to update that now because it doesn't comply with the current standards? The answer is no.
Yeah. The other thing that's interesting based on what Dave said and we've all been saying, don't you see kind of a conflict in the survey we did? Because the survey we did at the beginning said that 97, I think, % of the people attending have reserve studies that are less than 5 years old, but more than 50% of the people who responded said they had to have a special assessment or barring because they didn't have enough in their reserve study. So there's a little disconnect there that they may have a reserve study, but they may not be funding based on what the reserve study says.
Right.
So that came from the survey from 100 of you who were here. So this should solve that type of problem. Now there's a couple of other questions. If the facade of a multi-floor concrete structure included as a load-bearing, is the facade of a multi-floor concrete structure included as a load-bearing structural element, more specifically, the facade is masonry supporting itself and attached to the concrete beams at each floor? Great question. And I will tell you that the public policy update that CAI is going to approve this afternoon now incorporates facades in the public policy. That right now the balconies, which are generally considered part of the facade, are the only thing included within this legislation, but the self-supporting facade is not part of the primary load-bearing system. It's a great question. I will tell you that, well, let's see who asked it, but it's a great question. There are some locations in the state of New Jersey right now, Fort Lee, I think a couple of them, 2 or 3 of them, that have specific facade inspection requirements right now. But it's a great question. Right now, the facade is not part of the legislation. It may be edited someday. It's a great question.
So I see one, and it's a great point. Michael Polulak asked, is there a civil cause of action for not funding the reserves in accordance with the schedule? You will note that we did not include the ability of the DCA to enforce this. So the question becomes, well, how does it get enforced? We know the structural integrity issue gets enforced through the local building official. How does this get enforced? There would be a civil cause of action for violating the statute, and the board could be sued for breaching its statutory obligation, which would also be considered a fiduciary obligation if they do not follow the statute. And I suspect that if owners become aware of the terms of this, and I'm finding owners are getting more and more sophisticated all the time with the requirements of law, they will raise this at open board meetings. They will ask the board why they are in violation of the law. And I think that's the way we want to go about it. We did not want to put DCA in a position to start fining board members, that sort of thing. So we did not include that in the statute. I also see a question, Mitch, from Mike Henderson. How does this affect threshold funding? And maybe you want to deal with this, but I will point out that the statute allows the board to adopt any funding method that is one of the options given by the reserve specialist or engineer in the reserve report.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a good question. And most of you know what we're talking about. We're talking about the different types of funding plan. The legislation doesn't specifically say any type of funding plan. The main definition is adequate. And as you know, for those of you know, even baseline funding is considered adequate, even though it may be the most risky. And but threshold funding is not something is something you can do. Absolutely. It says is level 1 study required. Level 1 study is something where you're doing the entire study, starting from scratch, determining the components, the whole thing. And a level 1 study is not required unless you don't have a study. After that, it's not a problem updating a study. And let's see.
I can partially address Terry's question. She's asking, what if your documents severely restrict raising assessments or assessing special assessments without owner approval. I can tell you in the legislation, with respect to any potential financial difficulty as a result of a structural inspection that requires immediate action and you don't have funds, the new legislation empowers the boards, irrespective, it supersedes, irrespective of what the governing documents may say in an association about getting owner approval. If an engineer has documented a severe structural failure in the building system that requires immediate action, that the board can take the action irrespective of what their documents may say in limiting their power to either borrow or special assess. But that's only for structural. I don't think there's anything else that
Well, you
helps
shouldn't,
with.
and you shouldn't, there should be no special assessment required in connection with the reserves, even with a 10-year catch-up, because that should be incorporated in the budget. We're not talking about special assessments. You're 99% of all governing documents, and there are some exceptions, but they're rare, say that as long as it's included in the budget, it's totally up to the board as to what's included in the budget. So it's not a special assessment, and you have that 10-year period, or when the account goes negative, whichever occurs first, to do that catch-up. You just put it in the budget. You don't make it a separate special assessment.
But I think
I just
that
wanted to make, yeah, I just wanted to make the point about the structural portion that there's language that supersedes bylaws. But
yeah,
as to other,
I think that's a great point, because that's a critical part of legislation. And we should have included in our presentation, because it's critical that, you know, you don't want to ever be in a position where there's a safety issue, but the board has to vote for a special assessment to fix it. The legislation says if there's a safety issue, they can special assess or borrow without a vote. And I'm glad you brought that up, because that's a big part of this whole thing. All right, let's see. Let's see. Will this? I think this is a good question for Ed, because you've mentioned this a few times. Will this be tied into audits?
well, I think so. I mean, I think the auditors, when they, conduct their audit processes and look at the age of a reserve study and or its adequacy, if you will, or the lack of funding towards the reserve schedule, I think they're duty bound under their management letter criteria to begin warning the board and the management company that they're not meeting funding requirements and may be in jeopardy of this specific law. I'm sure all the auditors will be reading this and getting familiar with it. And again, back to the enforcement, we think that this can be in effect self-enforcing, that if auditors see that the reserves are not being funded properly for any number of reasons, they're going to issue management letter comments. They're going to be forewarning. And if there's still violation of that, you may start getting a qualified opinion, which you don't want on an audit.
Yeah, and the last question I see in the chat is about the various funding methods, but I think we answered that already a couple of seconds ago. Any other questions or anything from anybody? No. Thank you very much, everybody, for attending. You are the special group of 100 that got here early, and there's 250 people waiting outside the doors right now, sending me texts that are not happy. So I really appreciate everybody coming, and I thank Dave and Ed and Matt. And just so you know, I do have to, when we give presentations like this, if there's a celebrity in the audience, I have to point them out. And if you've all read the fact book that CAI publishes, it's done under Clifford Treese, who's in the audience. Cliff's a friend for many, many years. But any of those, if you want to see real facts in this world, and there are many of them, as you all know, look at the CAI fact book. And it was written by Clifford Treese, who's sitting in the screen. I think he's in California somewhere, but I have to point out the celebrity. So Cliff, thanks for being here. And thank you to everybody else. If you ever have any questions or anything, feel free to reach out to any of the three of us. If you have anybody who wants to see this presentation, there'll be a video, a recording of it. And we're doing again live again tomorrow morning. Hopefully the other presenters can make it. I really appreciate you guys being here too. So everybody,
nice job, guys. Thank you.
Everybody have a great day. Thank you very much for coming. I appreciate it. We appreciate it.
Everybody, thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.